They hadn't expected to find anything. The three climbers were halfway through their descent from Mount Hooker, battered from wind and the thin air, when one of them noticed a tangle of nylon webbing against a granite wall. At first, it looked like nothing more than a sun-bleached rope caught in a crack. But as they rappelled closer, their headlamps swept across a sight that froze all three in place. There, 200 feet above the valley floor, hung a forgotten camp. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for a pair of sleeping pads. A tent, once bright orange, clung stubbornly to the rock, its fabric shredded and flapping like loose skin. Beside it, anchored into the granite with rusting pitons, dangled a hull bag split open from years of exposure. Its contents spilled like bones across the cliff face. Cookware fused with rust, a climbing journal swollen and unreadable with mold, and, most chilling of all, a single sleeping bag, zipped tight cocoon-like. One climber whispered, almost against his will, "That shouldn't be here," because no one, absolutely no one, had been reported missing on this particular route in decades. Or so they thought. The camp was sealed in a tomb of silence. No footprints. No ropes leading away. Just that one sleeping bag, heavier than it should have been. The men debated what to do. Curiosity tugged at them, but fear pressed harder. Finally, one extended a trembling hand, unzipped the bag just a few inches, and recoiled with a cry. Inside wasn't just the mummified remains of gear. It was something human, something fragile and horrifyingly small. The mountain had kept its secret for 15 years. By nightfall, word spread across Wyoming. The barracks had been found. The story raced across the radio first, then local news. Climbers on Mount Hooker have discovered camp believed to belong to Grant Barrack and his teenage daughter, who vanished during a 2002 expedition. For 15 years, the disappearance had lived as little more than campfire lore. Grant Barrack, the confident outdoorsman with the sharp blue eyes, and his daughter Taraji, only 18, had set out for what was supposed to be their triumphant climb. They had carried enough gear for weeks, maps marked with meticulous precision, and years of experience between them. They had planned for every possible emergency, every possible one, except the one that mattered most. When rescuers searched back then, they'd found their truck parked neatly at the trailhead. Inside, fully charged satellite phones. Left behind, that detail had haunted investigators, family, and friends ever since. Why would Grant, careful to the point of obsession, leave behind the one thing that could save their lives? The discovery on the cliff didn't answer that question. It only deepened it, because along with the gear, along with the remains sealed inside the sleeping bag, investigators would notice something else. Only one sleeping bag had been there, one body, but two had vanished. From here, the narrative pulls us back in time, to the morning Grant and Taraji began their climb. Bright skies, laughter in the parking lot, a father's quiet pride, an 18-year-old girl with her whole life ahead, and a mountain waiting, indifferent, eternal, the mountain that would take them both, or perhaps only one. It was July 2002 when Grant Barrack parked his dark green pickup at the trailhead in the Wind River Range. The morning was crisp, the kind of mountain air that smelled of pine resin and snow melt. Taraji stepped out beside him, adjusting the straps of her overstuffed pack. 18 years old, she had the restless energy of someone who thought the world lay open before her, just waiting to be climbed. For a moment, she tilted her head back and stared at Mount Hooker, its massive granite face catching the early light. It rose like a fortress wall, sheer and unforgiving, a monolith that climbers call both a dream and a nightmare. Grant followed her gaze. He'd been here before, years ago, before Taraji was even born. Back then, the mountain had tested him but hadn't broken him. This time, though, it wasn't about proving anything to himself. It was about giving his daughter a story, a memory, an adventure that would bind them forever. He checked his gear again. Ropes, cams, food for 10 days. Enough for emergencies. Enough for comfort. And yet, when he glanced into the back seat of the truck, the satellite phone sat there in their case. He hesitated, one hand hovering. He should take them. He always took them. "Dad." Taraji's voice broke the moment. "You said we'd beat the weather if we got moving early." He nodded, closed the truck door, and slung on his pack. Right. Let's go. That decision, so small, so casual, would echo louder than any thunderclap. They hiked in silence for the first mile, their boots crunching over granite dust. Grant moved with steady purpose, his movements honed by decades of climbing. Taraji's pace was lighter, springier, as if her feet didn't quite believe the rules of gravity. Mom's still mad, you know, Taraji finally said, her breath coming in little puffs. Grant smiled, faint and tired. His wife had argued against the climb, said it was reckless to take their daughter up one of the hardest walls in America, said he was trying to relive his youth. Grant had told her it wasn't about him. It was about Taraji, about passing something down. She'll forgive me when we're back, he answered, when she sees what you can do. Taraji laughed, rolling her eyes. If we come back with photo on that summit, I think she'll forgive me, not you. Grant didn't answer. Instead, he studied her profile, the determination in her eyes, the way she carried herself. He saw his own stubborn streak in her. That was what worried him most. By the second day, the wilderness swallowed them whole. No self-service, no roads, no voices but their own. The peaks closing around them like jagged teeth. Storm clouds gathered, then passed, leaving everything slick and glistening. Taraji had begun keeping a little notebook. At night by the camp stove, she scribbled lines by flashlight, pages filled with quick sketches of cliffs and trees. Grant teased her, calling it her mountain diary. Someday, she told him, I'm going to write about this. About us. But she never got the chance. The last confirmed sighting came from two other climbers headed in the opposite direction. They crossed paths at a fork in the trail, shared a few minutes of small talk. The men remembered Grant, quiet, confident, watchful. They remembered Taraji, too, cheerful and eager, her laugh cutting through the alpine air. What they remembered most, though, was the way Grant looked up at the looming face of Mount Hooker as they parted ways. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He just stared, as if the mountain were staring back. That was July 9th. No one ever saw them again. The first sign something was wrong came 2 days later. They missed their scheduled radio call. Friends brushed it off at first. It wasn't unusual for climbers to lose track of time in the backcountry. But when another day passed, then another, the worry grew teeth. By July 12th, a search team had mobilized. Rangers, helicopters, volunteers. They found the truck at the trailhead, untouched. Inside, unopened water bottles, extra batteries, and 2 satellite phones, both charged, both useless without their owners. That detail gnawed at the rescuers. Grant was too meticulous, too careful. Why would he leave them? For weeks, they scoured the cliffs, scanning with binoculars, shouting their names into the void. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew grid patterns. But the mountain gave nothing back. No ropes, no footprints, no bodies. It was as if the Barracks had stepped off the face of the earth. When the official search was called off, their family was left with nothing but absence. A father and daughter, bound together by love and ambition, gone without a trace. Only the mountain remained, unchanging, silent, indifferent. And for 15 years, the story lay buried there, waiting for the day when the wind would shift and 3 strangers would stumble across a ledge suspended in time. The day the world would learn that not everything vanishes completely. The Barrack house was small, but always seemed full. Full of voices, full of plans, full of Grant's endless maps and Taraji's music floating down the hall. But in the weeks before the expedition, it was full of arguments. You promised, Evelyn Barrack said one night, standing in the kitchen with her arms folded. The light above flickered with the uneven hum of an old bulb. You told me, after Alaska, no more, not with her. Grant didn't flinch. He was at the table, a topo map of the Wind River Range spread out in front of him. His finger traced the jagged ridges, the contour lines that only made sense to climbers. This isn't Alaska, he said quietly. It's different. Different. Evelyn's laugh was sharp. Mount Hooker is one of the most dangerous climbs in this country, and you're dragging our daughter up there like it's some family picnic. Taraji, who'd been listening from a hallway, finally stepped into the kitchen. Mom, I'm not a little kid anymore. I want to do this. Dad thinks I'm ready. Her mother turned. eyes flashing. Do you? Or does he? Because I can't tell if this is about your future, Taraji, or about his past. Silence felt like a dropped stone. Grant finally looked up from the map, his jaw tight. It's about both. Taraji was used to being caught in their tug-of-war. To her friends, her father was a legend, a man who'd once scaled peaks in Patagonia, Yosemite, Alaska. To her, he was still the dad who burned pancakes on Sundays and taught her to tie her first bowling not in the backyard. But she also saw the shadows Evelyn pointed out, the way Grant stared at the mountains, as though they were the only thing that made him feel alive, the way he sometimes seemed restless at home, like a man pacing in a cage. Taraji wanted to believe this climb was about ego, that it was about her. She just graduated high school. College loomed in the fall. Everyone expected her to go, to study something practical. But in the quiet corners of her notebooks, she sketched peaks and valleys, wrote lines about freedom, about air so sharp it cut the lungs. She wanted to live a life that felt big, and Grant was offering her a doorway. Still, a part of her wondered, if they reached the summit, would it feel like her victory or his? The night before they left, Evelyn cooked dinner in silence. The clatter of pots was sharper than any words. Halfway through the meal, she set her fork down. "Grant, promise me one thing," she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled against the table. "Promise me you'll bring her back." Grant didn't hesitate. "I promise." Taraji remembered that moment for the rest of her life, or at least for the rest of the life anyone knew she lived. Her father's voice had been steady, certain like stone. She believed him. Evelyn didn't. The next morning, they loaded the truck before sunrise. Taraji hugged her mother tight, breathing in the smell of coffee and laundry soap, trying not to think about the way Evelyn's hands lingered on her shoulders. "Call me," her mother whispered. "Every chance you get. Promise me that." "I promise," Taraji said, but the call never came. Instead, 15 years later, it would be strangers, not her daughter, who brought Evelyn the news. Not a voice on the phone, but a headline on the radio. Climbers discover remains on Mount Hooker, believed to be linked to 2002 disappearance of father and daughter. Evelyn would sit alone in that same kitchen, the same flickering light overhead, listening to the words like stones dropping into water. Her husband had promised. But the mountain doesn't keep promises. Back in 2002, Grant and Taraji drove away with the truck bed rattling and the satellite phones forgotten behind the seat. Evelyn stood at the window, watching until the dust settled and the road turned empty again. She whispered, though no one could hear her, "Don't go." But they went, and only one of them would ever truly be found. The trail wound upward in switchbacks, carving to the Wind River Range like an ancient scar. For the first few miles, Taraji chattered, her excitement spilling over as she pointed out wildflowers and distant ridges, snapping disposable camera photos of everything. Grant smiled at her enthusiasm, though his eyes kept scanning the horizon, as if searching for something only he could see. By afternoon, the mountains swallowed them whole. Pines closing like sentinels, their branches blotting out the sun. Shadows stretched across the path, deepening into shapes that felt alive. The silence was profound, so complete that the crunch of their boots on granite sounded almost like trespass. "This place is different," Taraji whispered once. Grant adjusted his pack straps. "It's always been this way. Beautiful, harsh, the kind of place that doesn't care if you're ready." Taraji shivered, though the air wasn't cold. Each night, they made camp beneath jagged peaks that looked like teeth cutting into the sky. Grant showed her how to anchor the tent against sudden wind, how to store food away from bears. Taraji wrote in her notebook by flashlight, sketching the mountains as hulking silhouettes, her handwriting tilting into restless lines. One night, she wrote, "The mountain feels alive, like it's watching us." Grant didn't see her words, but he felt the same unease. On the third day, the trail faded into scree and talus. The sheer granite wall of Mount Hooker rose above them at last, a vertical mile of gray stone that looked impossible to conquer. Taraji craned her neck until it hurt, all mixing with dread. "Dad, are we really climbing that?" Grant didn't answer immediately. He stared at the wall, eyes narrowed, as though searching for old scars from his last attempt decades ago. Finally, he nodded. "We are. Looks like it could swallow us whole," she said softly. "It can," he replied, and shoulders packed. That night, wind ripped at their tent until the seams whined. Taraji dreamed of voices whispering from the cliffs, low and patient, like water carving stone. She woke with a start, her father already sitting upright, listening to the dark. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he lied. But he, too, had felt the strange pressure of the place. Not just weather, not just fear, something older, heavier. At dawn, they began their ascent. Harnesses clicked, ropes hissed through belay devices, and metal struck against stone in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Taraji climbed with surprising grace, her long limbs stretching, her chalk-streaked hands gripping with confidence. At belay stations, she grinned down at her father. "Still think I'm just a kid?" Grant smiled back, but his chest felt heavy. She was proving herself, yes, but she was also trusting with her life. Every rope knot, every anchor drilled into the cliff. A single mistake, and she would fall. And he couldn't shake the thought, what if I fail her? By midday, clouds began to gather. A storm was moving in faster than he expected. The air thickened with the smell of ozone, sharp and metallic. Taraji noticed too, pausing on a ledge as she caught her breath. "Dad, maybe we should," she trailed off, scanning the bruised sky. Grant checked their position. They were halfway up, committed to the wall. To turn back now would mean a dangerous retreat through slick stone. To press forward meant gambling against a storm. He chose forward. They reached a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for the tent. Grant rigged anchors, and together they set up camp suspended against a granite face. Taraji tried to laugh at the absurdity of sleeping on a cliff, but her eyes betrayed her fear. That night, the storm hit. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the cliff in blinding flashes. Thunder rolled through the valley like artillery fire. Rain hammered the fabric above them until it sagged under the weight. Inside, Taraji pressed close to her father, whispering, "Tell me we'll be okay." Grant wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We'll be okay," he said, but he wasn't sure he believed it. No one knows exactly what happened next. The journal Taraji had been keeping would later be found waterlogged and illegible, its last entry smeared into ink stains. But when 3 climbers stumbled on that same ledge 15 years later, they would find the tent still anchored, the haul bag split open, and a single sleeping bag zipped tight. One body inside. Not 2. At first, it was just a small ripple of worry. On July 11th, the Barracks were scheduled to radio in from the mountains. They never did. Friends waiting for their call assumed it was a simple delay. Climbers were notorious for losing track of time, chasing weather windows or summits. No one panicked. Not yet. But by the next morning, July 12th, the ripple had grown. Evelyn Barrack sat by the phone in their Wyoming home, tapping her nails against the counter. She had counted the days on the calendar, had circled the call date in red ink. And now, that circle felt like a wound. When the phone remained silent another day, she picked it up herself, dialing ranger stations, friends, anyone who might have heard from them. The responses were all the same. "No, nothing yet. Don't worry. Grant knows what he's doing." But Evelyn did worry, because Grant always followed the rules. Always. And if he hadn't called, it wasn't forgetfulness. It was something worse. By July 13th, the silence had become unbearable. Search and rescue was alerted. The Wind River Range, sprawling and jagged, became the center of Wyoming's largest manhunt in years. Helicopters circled above cliffs, their rotors chopping the air as spotters leaned out with binoculars. On the ground, teams spread in lines through alpine meadows and talus fields, shouting names into the wilderness. Grant, Taraji. Their voices bounced back from granite walls, warped and empty. Dogs sniffed trails that dissolved into nothing. And at the trailhead, rangers made their first discovery. The Barrack's truck parked neatly in the lot. Inside were food wrappers, folded maps, and 2 satellite phones. Both were fully charged. Both had never been touched. That detail sank into everyone's stomach like lead. Grant Barrack didn't make mistakes like that, unless something had already gone very, very wrong. As days bled into weeks, the search grew desperate. The helicopters mapped every visible ledge. Rangers climbed routes themselves, hammering anchors, calling out. Volunteers hiked for miles, their packs heavy with hope that dwindled each night around campfires. But the mountain gave back nothing. No ropes, no footprints, no gear, no bodies. It was as though the barracks had walked into the granite wall itself and vanished. The family clung to hope in their own ways. Evelyn refused to believe they were dead. She set out food at the table every night for 3, whispering prayers into the silence. Friends describe her as hollow-eyed, moving through her days like a ghost. Taraji's younger brother, Marcus, was only 12 at the time. He carried a photograph of his sister to school, refusing to let anyone touch it, as if his grip could keep her from slipping further away. Reporters swarmed. Newspapers ran the story. Experienced climber and daughter vanish in Wind River Range. Some framed Grant as reckless, dragging his teenage daughter onto one of the hardest walls in America. Others painted him as a father chasing one last adventure, swallowed by fate. But no theory mattered because no evidence existed. Weeks later, when the official search ended, the family was told what no family wants to hear, that the mountain had claimed them. Evelyn didn't accept it. No bodies, no proof, she told reporters, her voice sharp with defiance. My husband knows those mountains. My daughter's strong. If they're not found, it's because they're still out there. But no one believed her. Not really. By autumn, the case had drifted into myth. A father and daughter who vanished without trace. The mountain that swallowed them whole. The Wind River Range had always carried ghost stories of lost trappers, hunters, climbers who never came back. But now it had a new one, the barracks. And for 15 years, that was all there remained, a story, until 3 climbers, rappelling down Forgotten Face of Mount Hooker, stumbled on a ledge where time had stopped, a ledge where silence still lived, waiting to be broken. The 3 climbers hadn't planned to be heroes. They were chasing their own route, their own slice of glory, a clean descent down the southern face of Mount Hooker. But somewhere around the 200-foot mark, one of them noticed the unnatural geometry against the stone. A line too straight, a fabric too bright. At first, they thought it was trash, maybe the remnants of a storm-battered tarp. But as they swung closer on their ropes, the truth unspooled. It wasn't trash. It was a camp frozen in time. The tent, once a vibrant orange, was bleached pale by sun and shredded by wind. The haul bag dangled from its anchor like a corpse on a noose. It seemed split, contents spilling in clumps of rusted cookware, sun-cracked plastic, and a water bottle, so brittle it crumbled when touched. The strangest thing was how intact it all seemed, like someone had only just stepped away. Ropes still coiled neatly, anchors solid, no sign of a fall. And then there was the sleeping bag. It lay zipped tight against the granite, its nylon faded but sealed as if someone had gone to sleep and never woken. One of the climbers reached for it with gloved hands, hesitating. They unzipped just enough to glimpse what lay inside. A jawbone, teeth, the mummified edge of a human face. They recoiled instantly, almost losing their grip on the ledge. For a long time, none of them spoke. The mountain around them was dead silent, the kind of silence that presses into the bones. Finally, one of them said, This has to be them. They didn't need to explain who them was. By nightfall, news spread across Wyoming. Remains of missing climbers discovered on Mount Hooker. Search and rescue returned to mountain. But this time, they weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for the dead. Rangers rappelled to the ledge, bagging evidence piece by piece. They cataloged everything. The torn tent, the rusted stove, the broken journal swollen with water damage. They logged the remains, skeletal, incomplete, but identifiable enough for forensic testing. But when they finished, a single question rattled the entire investigation. Where was the second body? The sleeping bag had contained one set of remains. Likely Grant's, bigger bones, heavier frame. But Taraji? She was nowhere to be found. There were no remains outside the tent. No gear missing from the haul bag. No evidence she'd fallen or fled or been buried. It was as though she had never been there at all. The discovery reignited the case like wildfire. Reporters swarmed. The Barrack mystery returned to headlines. Some said Taraji had fallen into a crevasse, her body unrecoverable. Others whispered about darker possibilities. Had Grant done something to her? Had she done something to him? The forensic team couldn't say. What they found inside the bag was too weathered, too incomplete. DNA confirmed one set of remains belonged to Grant Barrack, but there was no trace of Taraji. Evelyn received a call on a Sunday morning. 15 years of waiting had turned her grief into something brittle, but hearing the words still shattered her. They found Grant, the voice said. Her breath caught. And Taraji? Silence. The official report was clinical. Remains consistent with one individual recovered. Investigation ongoing. But Evelyn heard only what wasn't said. Her daughter was still missing. 15 years after vanishing into the wilderness. She was still out there. Somewhere. Or worse, she had been there, but something had erased her. Back on the mountain, investigators studied the ledge again. Everything about it felt wrong. The tent wasn't collapsed, but zipped shut. The haul bag hadn't been ripped by animals, but by weather. The sleeping bag was zipped from the outside, not the inside, as though someone else had sealed it. It was the kind of detail that gnawed at the mind. If Grant had died in his sleep, who zipped him in? If he'd been alive when Taraji vanished, where had she gone? And if she had survived, why hadn't she come down? The mountain was silent. But silence, everyone knew, is not the same as an answer. The ledge on Mount Hooker became less a discovery site and more a crime scene. Rangers, forensic specialists, even FBI consultants were flown in to examine the strange camp suspended on granite. Every detail seemed to raise more questions than it answered. The first red flag was the tent. After 15 years of storms and exposure, it should have been shredded beyond recognition. Instead, though frayed, it was still anchored firmly, taut against a rock. The stakes hadn't been yanked loose by wind or weather. They had been carefully tied, reinforced with knots consistent with Grant Barrack style. It looked less like a camp abandoned in chaos, and more like one deliberately prepared for long-term stay. But why would they have stayed on a precarious ledge, storm after storm, when retreat was possible? Then there was the journal, found waterlogged and swollen. Most of its entries were ruined, black ink bleeding across the pages like veins. But a few words could be made out. Storm coming. Taraji restless. Keep moving. And then the final fragment, smeared almost to nothing. Not safe. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, unlike Grant's usual steady script. Forensic analysts couldn't determine whether it was his hand or Taraji's. That ambiguity haunted investigators. The sleeping bag was the most disturbing piece. It was zipped all the way up, from the outside. Inside were the partial remains of Grant Barrack. His body had mummified in the high, dry air, teeth still visible in the shriveled skin. Tests showed no signs of broken bones, no blunt trauma, no evidence of a fall. The cause of death couldn't be confirmed. But experts agreed on one chilling fact. No climber, especially an experienced one, zips themselves into a bag from the outside. Someone else had to have closed it. That someone could only have been Taraji, which led to the next question. What happened to her? Investigators combed the cliff face with ropes and drones. They searched the slopes below for scattered remains. Nothing, not a single trace of Taraji was ever recovered. It was as though she had been swallowed by the mountain. Theories spread quickly within the task force. Theory 1. Taraji fell during the storm, her body lost in the talus fields or crevasses below. Grant, in shock, maintained camp until he himself succumbed. But if so, why was his body zipped away so neatly? And where were her belongings? Her boots? Her harness? Theory 2. She survived. Perhaps she descended alone, disoriented, never reaching civilization. A second search combed the valleys for unidentified remains. None matched her. Theory 3. The unthinkable. That Taraji, either through accident or desperation, had a hand in her father's death. That she zipped him into his own shroud before leaving. If so, where did she go? Rangers quietly admitted another disturbing detail. The haul bag inventory didn't match. Taraji's spare jacket was missing. Her personal notebook wasn't there. A knife Grant always carried was gone too. It looked less like she had fallen, and more like she had walked away. For Evelyn Barrack, the findings were unbearable. She sat in her living room, the blinds drawn, the box of evidence photographs unopened on her table. "They want me to believe my daughter left him there," she whispered to a reporter, "that she vanished like smoke. But Taraji loved her father. She wouldn't leave him to die like that. And yet the mountain had given them no other explanation. The strangest clue came from the ropes. Tests showed they had been retied. Not once, but twice. One set of knots had clearly been made by Grant, neat, precise, double-backed. The other set was sloppier, newer, as though tied by someone less practiced, or by shaking hands. That second set of knots dated to after the time Grant is believed to have died, meaning someone, almost certainly Taraji, had remained alive on the wall longer than anyone realized. But where she went after that, no one could say. By the end of 2017, the official report was closed as inconclusive. The body was identified, the evidence cataloged. But behind closed doors, investigators admitted what everyone feared. The Barrack camp wasn't just the site of an accident. It looked like the aftermath of something else. Something that didn't fit inside the ordinary rules of climbing or survival. Something darker. When news of the Barrack discovery hit the public, the story metastasized overnight. What had once been a quiet mystery, preserved mostly in Wyoming circles, became national obsession. Everyone had a theory. On climbing forums, seasoned mountaineers poured over forensic reports like holy scripture. They highlighted the odd knots, the zipped sleeping bag, the missing gear. It was a fall, some insisted. She slipped. He couldn't bear to leave the site, so he laid down to die. Others countered. Then why was he zipped in? Why are her boots gone? That doesn't make sense. True crime blogs push darker ideas. Theory 1. The survival pact. Some believe Grant and Taraji had struck a grim deal when the storm trapped them on the ledge. One would stay with the camp. The other would descend for help. Taraji, young and strong, may have been the one to leave. Maybe she perished in the wilderness before ever reaching the trailhead. But if so, why hadn't her remains surfaced in the 15 years since? Theory 2. Patricide. The ugliest whisper suggested something unthinkable, that Taraji had killed her father. Maybe not with malice, but with desperation. A quarrel, an accident, a knife, a decision made in terror as the storm raged. Zipping him could have been a strange act of guilt, of respect, or finality. This theory made Evelyn sick, but it spread like wildfire. Theory 3. Escape. Some thought Taraji had survived and chosen not to return. A girl on the cusp of adulthood, suffocated by family tension, following her father into wild only to realize freedom was possible in a different way, that she had vanished deliberately, leaving her old life behind. But at 18, with no money, no contacts, and no sightings in 15 years, how could that be true? And then, there were the stories no one wanted to print. Except the internet has no filter. Theory 4. The mountain took her. The Wind River Range already carried its own folklore. Native stories spoke of spirits in the cliffs, guardians who punished arrogance. Some said the walls of Mount Hooker were alive, listening, feeding on the desperate. Taraji, they whispered, hadn't fallen. She had been taken. Hikers swore they heard voices echoing in the stone. Climbers claimed they saw a girl's shadow, moving along ledges where no one was. Of course, most dismissed it as campfire ghost stories. But the Barrack case gave those legends new teeth. Evelyn hated the theories. To her, each one was an insult, a knife twisted into the wound she lived with daily. On her worst nights, she read them anyway, unable to look away from the digital speculation about her daughter's fate. Marcus, now a grown man, responded differently. "People will say anything when they don't have answers," he told a journalist. But here's the thing. None of them were there. None of them know what it's like to feel that mountain pressing down on you. My dad did. Taraji did. And they're gone because of it. He stopped, his voice shaking. Unless she isn't. That sentence lingered in the air like a curse. The official report marked inconclusive. Close the case. But the public didn't. Every few months, a new lead surfaced online. A hiker who swore they'd seen a barefoot girl in the trees. A blurry photograph of a figure high on a ledge. A supposed diary entry recovered from Taraji's pack. Most were hoaxes. Some were too eerie to dismiss. The case refused arrest. It lived in the gap between logic and legend, in the silence of the mountain itself. And yet, for investigators and family alike, one fact remained unshakable. The sleeping bag had been zipped, and Taraji was still missing. For months after the discovery, the case sat in uneasy limbo. Investigators had exhausted the evidence. Journalists had wrung the headlines dry, and Evelyn lived in the purgatory of knowing her husband was gone, but her daughter's fate was still a question mark. Then came the phone call. It was early spring 2018 when Fremont County Sheriff's Office received a tip from a man in Pinedale, Wyoming. He swore he had seen a woman in her 30s hiking alone through the Shoshone National Forest. What struck him wasn't just her solitude, it was a resemblance. She looked like those pictures of the Barrack girl, he said. Older, sure, weathered, but same eyes, same jawline. She even had this way of looking past you, like she wasn't all the way here. At first, investigators dismissed it. Thousands claimed to have seen Taraji over the years, most sightings either mistaken identity or outright fabrications. But something about this man's account made them pause, because he hadn't reported it immediately. He'd waited weeks, and the reason he gave was simple. She scared me, he admitted. I've been in the woods my whole life, but I've never seen someone move like that. She was quiet, too quiet, like she'd been out there a long time, like she belonged to the mountain. Detectives visited the area, retracing his steps. In a clearing near Green River Lakes, they found something strange. A fire pit, still ringed with stone, ashes, and among them, a scrap of fabric, weather-worn, sun-bleached, but faintly visible, the edge of a logo. It was a climbing brand from the late 90s, one that had gone out of production years earlier. The same brand Grant Barrack had used. News of the possible lead leaked quickly. The internet ignited again. Was Taraji alive, living feral in the wilderness? Had she walked away from the cliff camp, from her father, from the world? Theories multiplied. She couldn't face the guilt of surviving. She was traumatized and never came back down. She was protecting herself from something or someone that had followed them into the mountain. Each idea was more unsettling than the last. For Evelyn, the lead reopened every wound. She wanted to believe her daughter might still be alive, but the idea that Taraji had been living just miles away all these years was unbearable. If she's out there, Evelyn whispered to a reporter, why hasn't she come home? Unless she can't. Marcus was less forgiving. If she survived, then she chose to leave us. And if she chose that, then she's already gone. The sheriff's office organized a quiet search of the area. Rangers combed the woods, not announcing their presence to avoid spooking whoever might be there. For days they camped, tracked, waited. They found no one. But on the last day, one ranger swore he heard movement at dusk, a figure darting between the trees, fast and sure-footed, leaving no trail. He chased until the light failed, his breath clouding the cold, but came back empty-handed. When asked later, he said only one thing: I don't know if it was her, but I've never felt watched like that before. Not by an animal, not by a person, by something else. The case file grew one more folder thicker, filled with testimony, photos, and fragments that added up to nothing. Officially, the lead was marked unsubstantiated. Unofficially, though, investigators began to whisper. What if Taraji Barrack hadn't died on Mount Hooker? What if she had walked away and never stopped walking? And as spring gave way to summer, hikers began reporting something else. Strange cairns appearing on trails near Mount Hooker. Piles of stone balanced in impossible ways. And on one, scratched faintly into the granite, a single word: safe. For nearly 2 decades, the Barrack mystery had lingered like a wound that refused to close. The Cliffside camp, the zipped sleeping bag, the missing daughter. It all pointed to a story no one could quite piece together. But in 2019, an archivist and lander stumbled across something that would change everything. Among the catalog of evidence boxed away from the original 2002 search was a sealed envelope, water damage, never properly logged. It had been overlooked for years. Inside was a fragment of paper, brittle and half-faded, torn from a notebook. On it, in shaky handwriting, were 4 words. I zipped them in. The note was signed with a single initial, T. The discovery reignited the investigation. Theories that once seemed wild now carried weight. Taraji hadn't fallen. She hadn't vanished in an instant storm. She had been there long enough to write that note. Forensic handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but the style, the curvature, bore striking resemblance to Taraji's known writing. If authentic, the note confirmed what many had feared. Taraji had survived her father, at least for a time, and she had been the one to close him inside the sleeping bag. But why? Investigators revisited the evidence with new eyes. The missing jacket, the absent knife, the sloppy knots tied after Grant's death, the cairns reported years later, the Eerie word carved into stone, safe. It all suggested Taraji hadn't just lived past that night. She had tried to keep going. The final revelation came from an unexpected source, a hunter deep in the Wind River Range, who turned in a knife he'd found lodged between 2 stones near a creek, rusted, weather-worn, but still faintly etched with initials on the hilt, GB. Grant Barrack's knife. Tests revealed a faint trace of blood, human, but too degraded for DNA. Alongside it, tiny fibers of fabric that matched the brand of Taraji's old climbing jacket. The evidence hinted at something chilling, a struggle. The official report never drew conclusions. It stated only that Taraji had been alive long enough to handle her father's remains, long enough to take his knife, long enough to vanish into the wilderness. But behind closed doors, investigators spoke more plainly. The zipped sleeping bag wasn't just a shroud. It was containment. Grant hadn't died peacefully. He had been sealed away, deliberately, as though Taraji had been protecting herself from him, or from what had become in those desperate, storm-lashed hours. Some believed Grant had snapped under the pressure, turned on his daughter, and she had been forced to defend herself. Others whispered that something on the mountain had changed them both, and Taraji's only choice was to walk away. Either way, the evidence suggested one truth. Taraji Barrack hadn't been the victim. She had been the survivor. But the twist didn't end there. 2 summers later, another group of climbers scaling Mount Hooker stumbled upon a crude cairn on a ledge no human had reason to access. At its base was a scrap of fabric tied around a stone, a faded strip of orange nylon, the same color as the Barrack tent, and written across it in black marker, nearly erased by time, was a message. I'm still here. The Barrack case remains open, unsolved, and endlessly debated. Was Taraji consumed by the wilderness, a ghost of the mountains that swallowed her? Did she choose exile, living feral and unseen? Or was that final message something darker, proof that survival had come at a cost no one could understand? The only certainty is this. Mount Hooker gave back Grant Barrack, but it never gave back Taraji, and maybe it never will.